was it you telling Lyle about something that was happening?
My dad.
Now to the Menendez brothers case, we're hearing new audio of them speaking from behind bars as the Los Angeles District Attorney says he'll review new evidence while considering resentencing the brothers.
There were people that were just following this case like a soap opera, like a novella, because it had so many twists and turns.
The Menendez brothers are speaking out 35 years after brutally parents. Eric and Lyle Menendez were convicted and sentenced for their crimes, but Netflix's new documentary, The Menendez Brothers, marks the first time the siblings have discussed what happened in depth. To quote them, "So much hasn't been told," said Eric, and I think that not speaking out doesn't help anybody. Lyle added that this happened because of family secrets and things in the past, and that now, 34 years after incarceration, there is finally a conversation happening where people can finally understand and believe the Menendez brothers. Now, this documentary started streaming last night, Monday, October 7th on Netflix, and it has audio interviews with both Lyle, who is now 56, and Eric, who is now 53. They had these conversations with director Alejandro Hartman, and the director described it as more like a chat. He said they got along very well, they began speaking about harder things, more difficult issues, and then Eric didn't want to be a part of it at the beginning, but eventually at some point Lyle talked to Eric. This was how the director discussed getting in touch with the brothers, and Eric accepted to be part of the documentary, and then that was completely different because the director came recommended by Lyle, so then Eric was a bit more open, and it was really great for everybody to be able to talk openly about difficult things. So, to go back to 1989, Jose and Kitty were found dead at their Beverly Hills home after Lyle called the authorities. But here's the thing, Lyle and Eric weren't initially named persons of interest, seeing as the police pursued other avenues, including a potential mafia hit, of all things. Now, Eric has expressed his disbelief that the police did not consider them suspects at the beginning, especially given the boys had no alibi and they had powder residue on their hands. Eric literally said, there was residue all over our hands. So, under normal circumstances, they would give you a residue test and the boys would have been arrested immediately. Eric added that there were also shells in his car, which was located inside the police search area. He said all they had to do was search my car, and if they would have just pressed him, he wouldn't have been able to withstand any questioning. He was in a completely broken and shattered state of mind at the time. Bosnick, who tried the case in 1993, was asked why it took so long for the authorities to look into the siblings, and she replied that Beverly Hills is a different kind of police department. They have much better customer service. Her words, not mine. So after killing their parents, Eric and Lyle went absolutely crazy on this lavish spending spree with their inheritance. They bought these fancy watches, they bought designer clothing, real estate, new tennis coach, and making various business investments. But here's the thing, in the documentary, Eric stated that this wasn't his idea of a fun thing, this was just a way to cope. He said the idea that I was having a good time is absurd. Because, everything was to cover up the horrible pain of not wanting to be alive. One of the things that kept him from taking his own life was, he felt like he'd be a complete failure to his dad at that point. Lyle echoed Eric's sentiment and said he wasn't enjoying himself as a playboy. Instead, he spent many nights crying, struggling to sleep, and feeling deeply distraught in the months after committing the deaths. The secret of why this happened and the secret that you are responsible is a huge weight. So for Lyle, there was a feeling of some relief after being arrested. He said, like so many of the emotions at that time in his life, it didn't make a lot of sense. Eric discussed how he struggled to adapt to this new normal, because from the moment that he got off the plane and the detectives put the handcuffs on him, in terms of getting arrested, everything changed. He said it was an ending of his life. He was a teenager and he had no idea of what was going to come. Now, Lyle thinks that his arrest was very much staged for the media, because the Beverly Hills police arrested Lyle at the family mansion in a total media circus moment. When reflecting on that moment, Lyle said they could have just called him and told him to go to the police station, but this was a staged arrest for a media circus, because they had called the media to be ready. Lyle was arrested with a SWAT team. They cornered the car on the road, like he was some sort of fugitive dealer or something. And despite his frustrations, Lyle did feel relief after the arrest, mainly because he no longer had to carry the secret of why this all happened and that he was partly responsible. When discussing the legal counsel, so Eric originally hired Leslie Abramson as his attorney, whereas Lyle brought on Jill Lansing to represent him. And Jill, allegedly, was not the most prominent defense attorney. She turned out to be remarkably skillful, very graceful, very honest, at least according to Lyle. Everything you don't usually find in attorneys, and she was perfect for this case. She cared. Now, if we're consulting the documentary, Bosnick, who I referenced earlier, didn't have the best things to say about Eric's representation. Abramson. If I told you what I really thought of Leslie Abramson, I would be sued. Or at least that's what the former lead prosecutor claimed. Because she, I think, has lost all her money. And I'm not giving up my house. All right, Bosnick. She said, I had no reaction to the Menendez brothers. There was no visceral reaction. I didn't feel like I was in the presence of pure evil. They were like potted plants to me. They were like poisonous potted plants. But there was nothing about them I found fascinating. They were just these dumb jock. That could be a documentary name. So Lyle argued that O.J. Simpson's acquittal actually had a huge impact on their second trial, which began about 8 days after Simpson's trial ended. So the brothers' first trial, by the way, where they were tried separately, kind of ended with a jury that didn't go anywhere. Lyle said, I didn't really think that it would have the profound effect on the public that it did in terms of high-profile defendants, so they got washed in that. Well, that's what Eric said. In the retrial, the brothers' defense team was not permitted to present evidence and testimony about their years of allegedly being harmed. The judge said, well, Eric and Lyle are not women, so the battered woman syndrome does not apply, so all of that trauma is not relevant, and it was not allowed into the second trial. Those are Eric's direct words, by the way. The judge instructed the jury to choose between a degree of first-degree killing or no crime at all, rather than giving them another option. The usual option. The second jury convicted the brothers because they saw a completely different trial that was engineered to guarantee their verdict. To show them so much less makes it not fair to the brothers, at least according to Hazel Thornton, who was a juror in the first trial. So more than 3 decades later, Eric still blames himself for what happened on the night of the deaths and what went down afterwards. He said, I went to the only person who had ever helped me, that ever protected me. Ultimately, that happened because of Eric, because he went to Lyle. And then afterwards, and according to him, let's just be honest, he was arrested because of me because I told his therapist, Dr. Ozio, because I couldn't live with what I did. I couldn't live with it. I wanted to way. I did not protect Lyle. I got him into every aspect of this tragedy, and every aspect of this tragedy is my fault. Whereas Lyle said he believed that part of this disastrous weekend occurred from him just being naive, that somehow he could rescue Eric with no consequence, he would confront his father, that his mother would somehow react for the first time in her life like a mother. Sadly, those were very unrealistic expectations. The documentary touched on how undercover journalist Norma Novelli contacted Lyle. So he thought she was writing a book about his life, but Novelli sold the recording she had of Lyle without his written or verbal consent. Lyle refused to take the stand during the second trial to prevent cross-examination following the release of the private diary of Lyle Menendez in his own words. To quote, hopefully there is an awareness that Norma in the end was no real situation. There's a misconception that her tape recording Lyle had some favor in the trial, which according to Lyle is completely not true. The Norma Novelli tapes were kept out because on those tapes, Lyle was making comments on his feelings about the judge. And, well, Lyle felt he was making very biased decisions, and he's completely allowed to have that thought. While discussing the making of the documentary, the director Hartman noted that speaking with Eric and Lyle, as well as juror Betty Oldfield, Katie's sister Joan, and prosecutor Pamela Bosnick, brought him back to the same conclusion, that this is such a complex story, and at some point it doesn't matter who was right or who was wrong. It was a tragedy. It was a real tragedy. We have to learn something about society, about raising people, about justice, in order to avoid these kinds of things happening again. Of course, there are still stories like this, and there will be stories like this in the future, but you have to learn something. So it doesn't matter who was right or who was wrong at the very end in some way. And for the director, that's very personal. And that's all for today, folks. I've been Alexa. See ya.